Follows the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that will follow and civil war until Egypt is reunited in the Middle Kingdom, and then we will turn our attention to the early New Kingdom when we have the first female pharaoh of any of the dynasties. Now, the Middle Kingdom will last roughly between 1975 and 1640 BCE. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom, we have a century and a half of constant warfare as different chieftains attempt to gain control of both sections of Upper and Lower Egypt, being unable to do so until we have them reunited under Mentuhotep, moving the capital to Thebes, which will remain a very important religious and civic center right across the river from Karnak, all the way through the end of the New Kingdom. Now, this period is marked by political instability. So even though Mentuhotep and others are able to reunite and then maintain control over Upper and Lower Egypt, it is with great military expense and cost. And so, as is true throughout all of human history, if we have political instability, that means we also have economic instability. And without massive amounts of resources and revenue, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom are unable to produce on the scale of their Old Kingdom predecessors, such as the Great Pyramids of Giza and other massive tomb and temple complexes. Instead, we find, which will be long-lasting as far as a new practice of burial, in the Middle Kingdom, we have large tomb projects being replaced by rock-cut tombs that are literally hewn out of cliff faces. So now we do not even see a structure that is freestanding for the deified pharaohs. Instead, they are hidden within the mountains and the earth itself. Now, this period is very difficult on rulers, seen here in an example in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City of the head of Senuseret. Now, Senuseret III, we know, is not going to have as much resources as his predecessors. We can tell that, number one, by the material he uses for his commission, such as yellow quartzite here, in place of the hard, expensive diorite that was imported from Nubia previously. Now, we know of this pharaoh that he was a good and able administrator, that he led additional military expeditions into Nubia, still controlling Upper and Lower Egypt. This is significant because Nubia is where all of the gold mines are and where the Egyptians get their gold. Thus, of course, we find kings come from all over the Middle East to beg the pharaohs for gold and their reserves that they have, along with their surplus in grain, as you read about in the Old Testament. Now, here is a photograph of this sculpture, this effigy, the portrait of Senuseret III in the Nelson Atkins Museum. Over life size, we would have had a very commanding full-scale sculpture originally had this survived intact. Now, if we compare the portrait here to an earlier one like Cameronebti and Menkaure, we find that the pharaohs are going to maintain a fairly consistent iconographic convention by way of the dimensions of the face, say the height of the ears, the almond-shaped eyes, the pursed lips, and then we still maintain and carry on that headdress, that Nemes headdress, that is a linen wrap around the head, which makes him look like a cobra. Now, we're going to reveal, however, if we compare him to earlier pharaohs, the true hardship that is taking place and is wearing on rulers, much like the portraits of Roman emperors in the late period, in the late empire, where we begin revealing the effect and the war weariness on these individuals. They are no longer the perfect deified gods who do not feel, who are invincible. Now we see his eyes sunken in. We find bags under them. We find this worried look, a line marking his brow. All of these indicators of what's happening at the time. Now, additionally, what we find in the Middle Kingdom is that appended to the Nimmy's headdress, we now have an actual uraeus cobra of kingship placed around the band. So this is the next step until we reach the final version of the pharaonic headdress with the later New Kingdom. Now we find that the Middle Kingdom is followed by the Second Intermediate Period between 1630 and 1520 BCE, when the Hyksos, a northern exterior peoples, are going to invade. Now Hyksos, according to the Egyptians, means shepherd kings. They are foreigners that come into the land and rule over them. They are despised by the native Egyptians, and so they plot to overthrow these Hyksos rulers. Now, the New Kingdom is going to find their overthrow in 1539 to 1075. And in this New Kingdom, beginning with the 18th dynasty in 1539, these native Egyptians regain control over their country, over Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, Thutmose III is going to be the stepson of the first female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. Here we find that he will extend the kingdom to the Mediterranean and all the way to Syria. Now, he is the first pharaoh to call himself as such, the term pharaoh meaning the great house. So the ruler now stands in for the ruling family and the great house of Egypt. Now we find that here at Deir el-Bahri, we have a massive monument that is going to show us how the New Kingdom will be quite different than the Old Kingdom. For the great monuments of the Old Kingdom, such as the Pyramids of Giza, are the large remnants of the tombs of these pharaohs, not their temples. The small temples were dwarfed in front of each one of these tombs. Now this will be the opposite in the New Kingdom. Here at Deir el-Bahri, you have the royal architect Sinmut designing the funerary temple for Hatshepsut. Now, we note that all we can actually see is the temple itself out front. Her tomb is actually embedded deep within the mountain. Now, the architect here, the named architect, we believe is Sinmut. At the time, we know that he was Hatshepsut's chancellor and possibly her lover. Now, the notion that they were lovers is going to be given credence by the graffiti that is inscribed within the temple, which has both of them in compromising positions. Now, Hatshepsut is going to be the fourth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. She is the queen and half-sister of Thutmose II. Now, this is how she is able to gain power for herself as the first female pharaoh in history. In 1479 BCE, she will be named regent for Thutmose III, a son by a minor wife, not her son, when he was 12 years old. Thus, he was going to be too young to rule, so we need to put someone in charge until he comes of age, usually around 18 years of age. Only we find that Hatshepsut is going to rule much longer than they intended a few years. She rules for nearly a decade and a half here. Obviously, we find that she needs an argument and a series of images as propaganda to promote her as the official regent, seeing the true potential of her stepson, here shown very often holding him, even though he was already 12 years old at the time, but reinforcing this notion that she is protecting the future pharaoh. Eventually, she will give up on trying to be the regent and then name herself, start calling herself pharaoh. And so if you're going to be a pharaoh, you need to build like one. And that's what we see here in a massive series of ramped colonnaded terraces that originally had very lush gardens, which would be significant and stand out because we are in a desert here at Deir el-Bahri. So we find this is very much like the environment where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were created, because of course we have to irrigate these areas and bring in exotic plants from other parts of the kingdom, in this case an expedition that the queen went on. Now here, the temple is going to be much larger, but still modeled on an earlier temple of Mentuhotep II, thus tying herself to a distinguished earlier pharaoh, using the same plan for the temple and merely expanding it, making it much larger. So here we have the ruins on the other side of her temple of what this is based on. Now, the cliffs behind the temple, given the verticality of the columns that she includes, are meant to relate to the permanence and stability of the mountain itself. Because, of course, her rule is very unstable, being the first female pharaoh, and so she needs to convince people of the fact that she will always be pharaoh, that she will always be the official ruler of Egypt, the incarnation of Horus, and her father being Amun-Ra. She even states clearly that she wishes her titulary to abide like the mountains. When the sun shines, its rays are bright upon the titulary of my majesty. My Horus is high upon the standard forever. Thus, of course, her divinity is going to be reminded of here looking at this temple, and is going to be as permanent as her incarnation as a god. Now, the columns that are used here show us how far the Egyptians have progressed in their knowledge of architecture. For unlike the stepped pyramid at Djoser and the attached columns there, now they are freestanding. The Egyptians realize they will stand up on their own. And here we find they are not fully in the round, but are beveled or angled on the sides. Hence, we have chamfered pillars, which will, of course, make up this post and lintel system in the front of this temple that gives you the vertical elements, much like the striations in the temple above and the mountains behind, and will be the model for early Greek architecture to come nearly 1,000 years later. Now, the inscriptions on the inside of her temple are going to herald her and hold her up as a great leader. For she is a woman, and even in Egyptian custom, whereby she might have been made pharaoh, but women are not allowed to go into battle. Therefore, she could not claim to be a great military leader. But she still needs to extend the boundaries of the Egyptian empire. So she puts together an expedition to go to the land of Punt on the Red Sea outside of Egypt, and brings back plants and animals from there and plants them in front of her very temple. Here we see people carrying these uprooted trees and sailing back from this land of Punt. In the front of the temple, leading to this ceremonial avenue of sphinxes, we have guardian figures, and just like the earlier pharaohs of Giza and at Karnak, we will see that sphinxes are the preferred Egyptian guardian figure to ward off evil and to protect the deified dead. So leading up to these massive ramps that we can see from 1,000 yards away, there is no surprise coming in the Egyptian design here. We would have to walk past dozens of these images of Hatshepsut as a sphinx. And here we have one of these standard images where her face is going to remain human, but her body is that of a lion, while she is still wearing the striated Nimmy's headdress and the false beard, thus communicating that she is the cobra of kingship and that she still wears the strap-on beard, the ceremonial beard that all pharaohs do. Now you'll notice in the sphinxes, they keep the tradition going back to the largest sculpture from antiquity, that being the Great Sphinx with the face of Menkaure on it at Giza. Now did, once again, Menkaure's Great Sphinx originally have a false beard as we see here? Perhaps, we do not know. There are several theories. But what we should take note of is how Hatshepsut is going to not show herself distinctly as a woman in most of these, but will minimize her femininity to maximize her association with earlier models of male pharaohs, thus giving her the same authority as a man. Now, this can also be seen in many sculptures that were smashed and destroyed at the end of her rule, and then her temple buried and forgotten. Now, these sculptures very often showed the pharaoh in a male guise, holding globular offering jars. Now, approximately 200 of these statues would have been smashed and dug into and dumped into a massive pit next to the temple. Now, when reassembling them, we can see that she is appealing to a very clever strategy to reinforce her own divinity. For priests would often use incense-burning globular offering jars to honor the god Amun-Ra, the creator god. Now, Hatshepsut, in these reliefs and engravings inside of the temple and inscribed on her statues, claims to be the daughter of Amun-Ra, and we even see images in the temple of Amun-Ra making love to her mother, and then Hatshepsut being born, showing that she is a direct descendant of the creator god, as are all other pharaohs. Now, we know that we find pharaohs would not kneel before any other mortal. So she must be worshiping and kneeling before her father, the chief god Amun-Ra. Now, here we have many different guises that she is in, again, holding globular offering jars and kneeling before her divine father, and even using, again, a masculine pronoun to describe her as him very often in these inscriptions. So in some of the images, we do find the pharaoh does accept her femininity and shows herself with breasts, but even then, she keeps the iconographic convention of the Nemi's headdress. So here we find that the way in which individuals can recognize who a pharaoh is, just as today we have certain markers for what someone in power would wear, and so we can identify them easily. So too did the ancient Egyptians understand this linen headdress, this false beard, this cobra on the top of the headdress on the mantle here, all of which are codes for iconographic conventions for understanding what a pharaoh is. Even in the positioning of her body, the makeup and musculature of it, and then her dress. For you notice here that she is shown as a he. She is shirtless. She is wearing a kilt and has, again, the male torso that's going to be established in the Old Kingdom that we saw with examples like the seated statue of Khafre and, once again, the standing statue of Menkaure. So this just shows us that if she were to be taken seriously, she had to adopt the same symbolism, the same markers that communicated power earlier for pharaohs before her. Following Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, we have the last great warrior pharaoh, Ramses II, who rules, not lives, but rules for nearly 7 decades. And as is the case for all Egyptian pharaohs, it is expected that he continue building projects until his death. Therefore, we have monuments with Ramses II and his face, name, and his deeds chiseled across Egypt. Now, this is going to be the pharaoh mentioned in the book of Exodus, who supposedly is holding the Israelites. He fights the Hittites in the north and expands the territory all the way into Syria and beyond. And he builds many temples and complexes, such as that at the second cataract of the Nile, Abu Simbel. At the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, we have the tradition in the New Kingdom carried on, where we have the most visible and prominent elements on the exterior, not relating to the tomb, but instead the temple out front. Now, this is going to be the site of an engineering marvel in 1968, when this temple was moved 700 feet to avoid submersion in the Aswan High Dam. It was then, with a coalition of American, Egyptian, and European archaeologists and engineers, taken apart piece by piece and reassembled, this entire mountain reassembled, 700 feet away. In reassembling these massive colossi, which there are 4 of, with the face of Ramses II on each one, we find that at 12 times the size of an ancient Egyptian that we are sacrificing detail for scale here, as he is shown seated rigidly at a right angle with his arms on his knees as he stares out, wearing the false beard, the uraeus cobra of kingship, and the Nemes headdress, clearly being identified as a pharaoh and as Horus incarnate in this world. Elsewhere on the exterior of the temple, we have the pharaoh shown as a conqueror, as he brings back and subjugates all of these various slaves from the Hittite Empire in sunken relief. Now, unlike regular low relief, sunken relief actually cuts into, in a negative fashion, the dark outlines and contours of these figures. Thus, it's going to be inset behind the surface of the stone wall instead of projecting from it in other examples. This gives a very clear, graphic, and visible way in which to communicate at a distance given the shadows and contours that are created. Now, just like other temples, we find the exterior has 4 effigies of the pharaoh, massive statues dedicated to him, while on the interior we move into the underworld, where the actual inner sanctuary and crypt would be. Now, as in New Kingdom examples like Senmut's funerary temple of Hatshepsut, we find that the tombs, which earlier would have been the most prominent, are now hidden inside of the mountains themselves. We must enter inside, and of course only pharaohs and high priests are allowed to do so, in order to find the final statues and burial places. As we enter into the mountainside, we find carved out of the living rock itself, we have entering into the crypt, as though we are entering into the underworld, walking beside and in between these massive statues. The statues are going to show the pharaoh Ramses II in the guise of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Now, he is shown as a statue or column, and when they are male, these are known as Atlantids, or as the Greeks will call them, Herms. Now, we find that the pharaoh is shown as Osiris with his arms rigidly bound to his body in an X shape, carrying a riding crop and a whip, and then he's going to be in the pose of the first mummy, because Osiris was the first mummy to enter the underworld, thus he rules over it. Along with Abu Simbel, we have numerous commissions by Ramses II throughout Egypt. One of the most prominent is going to be the worship of the pantheon carried out at Karnak, in the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. Here we find that a successive number of pharaohs from the 18th and 19th dynasties will continue to build and add to this huge complex dedicated to worshiping not just Amun-Ra, but all gods in the Egyptian pantheon, or all the gods in ancient Egypt. Now here we have the temple built around an artificial lake, which stands in for those primeval waters at the beginning of time, out of which a sacred temple or bin is going to rise. Hence the temple here is meant to reference that mound on which Amun-Ra will appear from these dark primordial waters, drying them up as the sun. Here, this artificial lake still survives to this day, as do much of the temple complex aspects itself, from the pylon walls to the hypostyle hall. Leading up to the temple, as with Hatshepsut's tomb and temple out front, we have a series of sphinxes. So here we have the avenue of the sphinxes leading up into the walls that are meant to intimidate us as guardian figures. For the walls shut off the sight, and Amun-Ra himself guards the temple as, again, a sphinx, but in this case, a sphinx with a lion body and a ram's head. Now, these repeat over and over as the principal and primary creator god and the god of the sun is going to be staring down on us. We dare not defile his temple if we do not belong there. Now here we have these images still performing the same function as they had in Assyria, as in the Hittite lands, as in Persia. All of them had guardian figures to terrify those coming to visit and worship the pharaoh and gods. Now, only pharaohs and priests could enter the sanctuary through the hypostyle hall, and these reliefs are going to cover the facade of the pylon walls, which are slanted walls on the exterior, again in sunken relief, communicating the greatness of Ramses II and other pharaohs that patronized this site. They are going to be shown generally coming to the gods, holding the symbols or the Ankh, the symbol of eternal life. Thus, through the commissioning and patronizing of these gods, the pharaohs cement their place in the afterlife. Now, one of the greatest inventions of the Egyptians is going to be an architectural addition to structures that up until now had been only post and lintel, thus could not let in light to dark, nebulous interior spaces. So here, in a reconstruction of the hypostyle hall, we continue those freestanding columns, massive, massive forests of them here, and a new invention. So in the hypostyle hall, which is a row of columns supporting a roof, which is what a hypostyle hall is, literally a hall of columns, we have each one of them decorated with sunken relief sculpture, with deeply inset and cut outlines, so we can read them very graphically. Even easier at the time, they would have been polychromed or painted in encaustic, making them even easier to understand. Now, the columns are massive, at 66 feet tall, supporting this lintel above them. Now, they are 22 feet in diameter. It takes nearly 10 men just to encircle hands around them. Now, they are put together not with the help of cement, but are cut as solid stone blocks in cylinders that lay one on top of the other. The forms, we will note, are going to be of the natural flora in ancient Egypt, in this case, a papyrus blossom. Now here we have another image showing you these blossoms that are growing from the floor and that would have been very intimidating and dominating this interior space. Now, the interior space would also have been illuminated thanks to the new invention of a clear story. Now, the clear story is going to be an additional story above the standard level of columns below. Thus, we have slats that let in light and ventilation to the interior space, which would otherwise only be illuminated by way of, say, gas lamps and or torches. Now, this is going to be a technique that's adopted and used by Christians in their early designs as well. At the same time, across the river in Thebes, the capital, we have very exciting activities in tomb decoration showing us a new direction and forecasting that something is about to change in the new kingdom, because we see relaxing conventions. Here we find Nebamun hunting birds in the tomb of Nebamun in Thebes from 1390 to 1352 BCE. Now, in his tomb, we find there are generally only two types of decorations, that relating to agriculture and hunting to be common in ancient Egypt. In this case, we find that hunting is illustrated, showing us what he is doing in his eternal afterlife. Now, this is painted in fresco secco, which is painted on dry lime plaster, appropriate for Egypt because it must stay out of the sunlight and away from moisture. So desert tombs are perfect for this technique, which allows a great amount of detail, such as the fur on the cat, or the scales on the fish, or the feathers on these birds. Now we know that, thanks to the hieroglyphic decoration behind him, that he is a scribe and counter of grain, having a very important job in ancient Egypt to record and then distribute grain production to the peoples. Here we find that behind him, the hieroglyphics tell us that Nebamun is enjoying recreation in his eternal afterlife. So generally, whatever is illustrated in a scene will be also elaborated on in the hieroglyphics. Now, in the hierarchy of scale, we find that Nebamun is much larger than his wife directly behind him and his daughter below him. He is taking part in an activity that he would have in his life given his station, which is recreational hunting. However, this goes beyond recreational sport into the allegorical, because just as hippopotamus hunts, which are going to reenact the hunting scenes that reference Horus hunting his father's murderer Seth, we still have that carried out here. That's how we celebrate the victory of justice over vice that Horus won, and so we also hunt on the Nile. Now, the active pose is traditionally reserved only for pharaohs when it comes to this particular one. Naturalism is generally only common in the lower classes, whereas with T watching hippopotamus hunt, his servants who are nude are doing the actual hunting. He is stationary and immobile. This is going to take its cue from those early images of pharaohs with the right arm raised. In this case, the mirror reverse, we find Nebamun has his left arm raised, about to strike 3 birds he has grasped with his right hand. Whereas the pharaoh would be striking down an enemy with his right hand held by his left with the hair of the enemy. Now, this relaxing of conventions is going to tell us that things are already changing in ancient Egypt. Next time, we will carry on with the later New Kingdom and what happens with a new ruler who will replace polytheism with monotheism, that being Akhenaten, and then his son Tutankhamun.